The dust stung Bethany Evans' eyes as she clutched her newborn daughter to her chest, the wagon wheels grinding to a halt at the edge of town where her father had decided she was no longer welcome. It was 1875 in the harsh territory of Wyoming, and at 20 years old, she had committed the unforgivable sin of bearing a child out of wedlock, her dreams of a respectable life dissolving like morning mist under the brutal western sun. "This is as far as we go," her father announced, his voice as cold as the winter winds that swept across the plains. Reverend James Evans wouldn't even look at his daughter as he handed her the small cloth bundle containing what few possessions he'd allowed her to take. "You've brought shame upon this family, Bethany. The Lord's mercy extends beyond my own." "Father, please," Bethany pleaded, her voice cracking as the baby stirred against her breast. "Catherine is just an innocent child." "That bastard has no name in our household," her mother whispered harshly from the wagon seat, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if Bethany had already disappeared from sight. The baby began to cry, a thin wail that pierced the afternoon air. Bethany's younger sisters peered from beneath the wagon's canvas cover, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They had been forbidden to speak to her, to touch her, to acknowledge the niece they would never know. "You have until nightfall to find shelter," her father said, snapping the reins. "May God guide you to repentance." The wagon lurched forward, leaving Bethany standing alone on the dusty road leading into Sweetwater, a small but growing settlement that served as a waypoint for cattle drives and the occasional stagecoach. She had nothing but a change of clothes, a small pouch containing her grandmother's silver locket, and $7 sewn into the hem of her dress, a secret gift from her youngest sister, who had pressed it into her hand during a stolen moment of farewell. The baby's cries grew more insistent. Bethany gently bounced her daughter, fighting back tears that threatened to blur her vision. She couldn't afford the luxury of despair, not with Catherine depending on her for survival. "Hush now, little one," she whispered, adjusting the thin blanket that shielded the infant from the relentless sun. "We'll find our way." Sweetwater sprawled before her, a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings, most of them saloons and gambling halls where no decent woman would dare enter. The church stood at one end of town, but Bethany knew better than to seek sanctuary there. Her father's letters would have preceded her, warnings about the fallen woman who had disgraced her family. The stagecoach station appeared to be her best hope. Perhaps there might be work cleaning or cooking, something to earn enough for a room at the boarding house until she could formulate a more permanent plan. With determination born of desperation, Bethany squared her shoulders and began walking toward town, each step carrying her farther from everything she had ever known. The station master, a balding man with suspenders stretched tight across his substantial belly, barely glanced at her when she inquired about work. "Nothing for a woman with a baby," he said flatly. "Can't have crying disturbing the passengers. Try the laundry down by the creek." The laundry proved no more welcoming. The proprietress, Mrs. Gilman, a hard-faced woman with hands reddened from lye soap, looked Bethany up and down with undisguised contempt. "I know who you are," she said. "Reverend Evans' girl. Word travels fast in these parts." "I run a respectable business, miss. Can't be hiring women of your circumstances." By late afternoon, Bethany had been turned away from every establishment that might have offered respectable employment. The baby was fussing, hungry, and uncomfortable in the heat. Bethany's own stomach growled with hunger, but she dared not spend any of her precious coins until she had secured shelter for the night. The sun was beginning to sink toward the distant mountains when she found herself outside the Silver Spur Saloon. The raucous laughter and piano music spilling through the swinging doors made her cringe, but desperation was a powerful motivator. Perhaps they needed someone to wash dishes or sweep floors, work she could do with Catherine sleeping nearby. Steeling herself against the shame, Bethany approached the back entrance, only to find her path blocked by a woman in a gaudy red dress, her face heavily painted, her blonde hair piled in elaborate curls. "Looking for work, honey." The woman asked, eyeing the bundle in Bethany's arms with something like pity. "Yes, madam," Bethany replied, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the saloon. "With a baby, not likely," the woman said, but her tone had softened. "Barney don't hire mothers, says they're unreliable." She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a coin. "Get yourself something to eat. There's a widow woman, Mrs. Abernathy, lives in the little house past the blacksmith's. She sometimes takes in strays." Bethany's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the coin with trembling fingers. "Don't thank me," the woman said sharply. "Just get that little one somewhere safe before nightfall. Town's no place for a baby after dark." With renewed purpose, Bethany made her way toward the blacksmith's shop at the edge of town. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil guided her to a weathered building where smoke billowed from a stone chimney. Just beyond, as the saloon woman had indicated, stood a small cottage with neatly tended flower boxes beneath the windows. Before Bethany could reach the gate, the baby began to wail in earnest, her tiny face scrunched and red with effort. Fumbling with her bundle of possessions, Bethany sought to quieten her daughter, aware that her own milk had grown scant from stress and poor nourishment. "Sounds like someone's mighty unhappy," a deep voice observed. Startled, Bethany looked up to find a man watching her from the doorway of the blacksmith's shop. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms darkened by the sun, he cut an imposing figure. His face was partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes that regarded her with curiosity rather than judgment. "She's hungry," Bethany explained unnecessarily, embarrassed by her disheveled appearance and the baby's distress. "I'm looking for Mrs. Abernathy's house." "You found it," the man said, stepping fully into the fading light. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the scar that ran along his left cheek. "But I'm afraid Mrs. Abernathy passed on last winter. Influenza took her." Bethany's heart sank. Her last hope vanished. The baby's cries intensified, and she swayed slightly on her feet, exhaustion and hunger conspiring against her determination to remain standing. The man moved with surprising speed for someone of his size, closing the distance between them in long strides. "Here now," he said, guiding Bethany to a rough-hewn bench outside the shop. "Sit before you fall." Too weary to protest, Bethany sank onto the bench, cradling Catherine against her shoulder, patting the infant's back in a futile attempt to soothe her. "When did you last eat?" the man asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Yesterday," Bethany admitted, "but I have money. I just need to find someplace that will take us in." The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then he reached for a water skin hanging by the shop door and offered it to her. "Drink," he instructed, "then we'll figure something out." The water was cool and sweet, easing the dryness in Bethany's throat. As she drank, the man disappeared into the shop, returning moments later with a chunk of bread and a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth. "It's not much," he said, "but it should help until proper supper." "Thank you, mister." Bethany accepted the food with a gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her composure. Forrester, Flynn Forrester. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat, cropped short at the sides but longer on top. "I took over the smithy after old Abernathy died. His wife left me the cottage in her will, said I'd been like a son to them." Bethany nodded, taking small bites of the bread and cheese, aware of Flynn Forrester's eyes on her and the baby. She expected questions, demands for explanations, but he simply retrieved a bucket of water from the pump and set it near her feet. "For washing up, if you've a mind to," he said. "I need to finish a job inside, but you're welcome to rest here. Nobody will bother you." Before she could respond, he had retreated into the smithy, the glow of the forge casting his silhouette in sharp relief against the darkening sky. Bethany ate slowly, savoring each bite, then used the water to wash her face and hands, and to dampen a clean corner of Catherine's blanket to cool the baby's flushed skin. The rhythmic sound of hammer on metal resumed, oddly comforting in its constancy. Catherine, soothed by her mother's full attention and the white noise of the blacksmith's work, finally quieted, her tiny fists unclenching as she drifted into sleep. Bethany had nearly dozed off herself when Flynn emerged from the shop, wiping his hands on a rag. The sky had deepened to indigo, stars beginning to pierce the darkness with pinpricks of silver light. "You'll be needing a place for the night," he said, matter-of-factly. "Yes," Bethany agreed, dreading the answer. "Is there an inn nearby that might take us in?" Flynn shook his head. "Nothing suitable for a woman alone with a child." He cleared his throat, seemingly uncomfortable. "I've got the cottage, 2 rooms. You could take the bedroom, and I'll sleep in the forge as I often do when work runs late." Bethany stared at him, searching for signs of impropriety in his offer, but his expression remained earnest, his eyes meeting hers without guile. Still, propriety demanded she refuse. "I couldn't impose," she began, but Flynn cut her off with a raised hand. "It's no imposition. The place sits empty most of the time, and Mrs. Abernathy would have done the same. She was a Christian woman who believed in helping those in need." He gestured toward Catherine. "That little one deserves a proper roof over her head, at least for tonight." The logic was undeniable, but Bethany hesitated. Her father's warnings about the wickedness of men echoed in her memory, yet the same father had abandoned her to the mercies of strangers just hours earlier. "One night," she conceded finally. "I'll pay you what I can." "We'll talk about that tomorrow," Flynn said, gathering her small bundle of possessions. "For now, let's get you both inside before the night chill sets in." The cottage was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a bedroom just large enough for a brass bed and a chest of drawers. Flynn quickly built a fire, then excused himself to retrieve supplies from the trading post before it closed for the night. Left alone, Bethany explored her temporary sanctuary. The bedroom contained a quilt-covered bed that looked impossibly inviting after her exhausting day. On the wall hung a framed sampler with the words, "The Lord is my shepherd," worked in faded thread. A rocking chair stood in one corner, and Bethany sank into it gratefully, still holding Catherine against her chest. Flynn returned with a basket containing milk, eggs, bacon, and to Bethany's astonishment, a small bundle of baby clothes and soft flannel for diapers. "Mrs. Henderson at the store has 8 grandchildren," he explained, setting the basket on the table. "She said these belong to the youngest, who's outgrown them." "I don't know how to thank you," Bethany said, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. Flynn appeared embarrassed by her gratitude. "No need for thanks, just doing what anyone would do." But they both knew that wasn't true. No one else in Sweetwater had offered help to the disgraced daughter of Reverend Evans and her illegitimate child. After a simple meal of scrambled eggs and bacon, which Bethany insisted on preparing despite Flynn's protests, he excused himself to return to the smithy where he'd made up a pallet for the night. Alone in the cottage, Bethany bathed Catherine in a small basin, dressed her in one of the soft gowns Mrs. Henderson had provided, and settled into the rocking chair to nurse her daughter before bed. As Catherine suckled, Bethany gazed down at her perfect face, the delicate eyelashes resting against plump cheeks, the tiny hand curled possessively around her mother's finger. Love washed over her in a wave so powerful it nearly took her breath away. "We'll be all right," she whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's downy head. "Somehow we'll make our way in this world, you and I." Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed with Catherine nestled beside her, Bethany offered a silent prayer of thanks for Flynn Forrester's unexpected kindness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight they were safe and warm, and that was enough. Outside, in the rough comfort of the smithy, Flynn Forrester lay awake, listening to the night sounds of Sweetwater, the distant piano from the saloon, the occasional shout or burst of laughter, the soft nickering of horses in nearby stables. His thoughts kept returning to the woman and child sleeping in his cottage, to the quiet dignity with which Bethany Evans had faced her situation, to the fierce love evident in every protective gesture toward her daughter. He had recognized her immediately as the Reverend's eldest daughter, though they had never been formally introduced. Flynn rarely attended church, finding more comfort in the honest work of his hands than in the reverend's fire and brimstone sermons. But he had seen Bethany from afar, singing in the choir, her face lit with a serenity that had always struck him as remarkable. There had been whispers, of course. Sweetwater thrived on gossip, and the disappearance of the reverend's daughter for several months, followed by her abrupt return to town under such circumstances, had provided ample fodder for speculation. Flynn had paid little attention, having no taste for rumor-mongering. But now, with Bethany and her child under his protection, however temporarily, he found himself wondering about the man who had fathered the baby only to abandon them both to such a fate. Flynn's last conscious thought before drifting into sleep was a resolution. As long as Bethany Evans and her daughter remained in his cottage, no harm would come to them. It was a promise made to himself, but it carried the weight of an oath. Dawn broke with the characteristic brilliance of a Wyoming summer morning, sunlight flooding the eastern sky in a wash of gold and rose. Bethany woke to the unfamiliar sound of a rooster crowing nearby and the even less familiar sensation of having slept soundly through the night. Catherine stirred beside her, making the little snuffling noises that preceded waking. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and Bethany sat up, momentarily disoriented by her surroundings. The cottage, Flynn Forrester's generosity, the uncertain future that stretched before her. Before she could dwell on these thoughts, a soft knock sounded at the bedroom door. "Miss Evans." Flynn's voice was hesitant. "I've made coffee if you'd care for some, and there's breakfast when you're ready." "Thank you," Bethany called, surprised by this additional kindness. "We'll be out shortly." She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, grateful that it showed fewer signs of travel than the one she'd worn yesterday. After changing and feeding Catherine, she emerged from the bedroom to find Flynn setting a plate of bacon and biscuits on the small table. He had clearly been up for some time, the fire was burning cheerfully, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the cottage. "Good morning," he said, glancing up from his task. He had shaved, Bethany noticed, and changed into a clean shirt, though his trousers still bore the marks of his trade. "Good morning," she replied, suddenly shy in the bright light of day. "You shouldn't have gone to such trouble." Flynn shrugged. "No trouble. I usually eat before starting work anyway." He gestured toward a wooden box lined with blankets that had been placed near the hearth. "Thought the little one might need a place to rest. It's just a crate from the mercantile, but it should serve until something better comes along." Bethany blinked back tears at the thoughtful gesture. "It's perfect," she said, gently laying Catherine in the makeshift cradle. The baby yawned hugely, then settled back to sleep, content after her morning feeding. "She's a good baby," Flynn observed, pulling out a chair for Bethany at the table. "Yes, she is," Bethany agreed, taking her seat. "She rarely cries without cause." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Bethany savoring the simple but satisfying food. Flynn's cooking was basic but substantial, clearly designed to fuel a day of physical labor. "I thought about your situation," Flynn said finally, refilling her coffee cup. "If you're agreeable, I have a proposition." Bethany tensed, her hand tightening around the cup. Despite his kindness, Flynn Forrester remained a stranger, a man about whom she knew very little. "What sort of proposition?" "A business arrangement," he clarified quickly, seemingly aware of her apprehension. "The cottage needs looking after, cleaning, cooking, that sort of thing, and I've been taking my meals at the hotel since Mrs. Abernathy passed, which isn't ideal. You're offering me employment?" Bethany asked, hardly daring to hope. Flynn nodded. "Room and board for you and the baby, plus a small wage. In exchange, you'd keep house and prepare meals." He hesitated, then added, "I'd continue to sleep in the smithy, of course. There'd be no impropriety." It was a generous offer, far better than anything Bethany had dared to hope for. Yet she hesitated, aware of how such an arrangement might be perceived in a town already predisposed to think the worst of her. "People will talk," she said quietly. "A single woman living in your cottage, even with these arrangements, it could damage your reputation." Flynn's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Miss Evans, I'm the town blacksmith, not a politician. My reputation rests on the quality of my work, not on who keeps my cottage tidy. Still, Bethany persisted, the gossip, let them gossip, Flynn interrupted, his voice firm. I've never much cared for the opinions of those who have nothing better to do than mind others' business. His expression softened as he glanced toward the makeshift cradle. Besides, that little one deserves a chance, same as anyone. I won't see you both cast out with nowhere to go. Bethany studied him, trying to discern his true motives. His face was open, his gaze steady and direct. There was no hint of calculation or hidden agenda in his manner, only a straightforward offer of assistance that seemed rooted in basic human decency. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me." Flynn considered her question for a moment before answering. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly," he said, his hand unconsciously rising to trace the scar on his cheek. "This came from a barroom brawl when I was younger and more foolish. For years after, folks looked at me like I was nothing but trouble, ready to explode into violence at any moment." He shook his head. "It wasn't true then, and whatever they're saying about you now isn't the whole truth either." His insight startled her. "No," she agreed softly, "it isn't. So do we have an agreement?" Flynn asked, extending his hand across the table. Bethany hesitated only a moment longer before placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of hard work, warm and solid against her skin. "We do," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester." "Flynn," he corrected with a slight smile. "If you're to be keeping my house, we should dispense with formalities." "Flynn," she repeated, returning his smile tentatively. "And I'm Bethany," he nodded, releasing her hand. "Welcome to your new home, Bethany. I'll leave you to settle in while I open the shop." He rose from the table, donning his hat. "Oh, and one more thing, what's the little one's name? Seems I should know, since she'll be living under my roof as well." "Catherine," Bethany said, glancing fondly at the sleeping infant. "Her name is Catherine," Flynn nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Catherine," he repeated, testing the name. "It suits her." With that, he departed for the smithy, leaving Bethany to contemplate the unexpected turn her fortunes had taken. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that provided Bethany with a sense of stability she had sorely lacked since discovering her pregnancy. She rose early to prepare breakfast before Flynn began his workday, then spent the morning cleaning the cottage, washing clothes, and tending to Catherine. In the afternoons, while the baby napped, she baked bread or prepared stews that could simmer slowly until supper time. Flynn took his midday meal in the smithy, not wanting to interrupt his work, but returned in the evenings to share supper at the small table, where their conversations gradually grew less awkward and more companionable. Bethany learned that Flynn had come west from Pennsylvania following the war between the states, seeking opportunity in the expanding frontier. He had apprenticed with a blacksmith in Cheyenne before making his way to Sweetwater, where old Mr. Abernathy had been looking to train someone to eventually take over his business. The childless couple had treated Flynn like a son, teaching him not only the blacksmith's craft, but also the value of community and honest dealings. In turn, Bethany shared carefully edited stories of her own life, her childhood in Illinois, her family's move west when her father received the call to minister to the growing settlement, her love of music and books. She did not speak of Catherine's father or the circumstances of her pregnancy, and Flynn never asked, respecting the boundaries of her privacy. As July gave way to August, Bethany began to venture beyond the confines of the cottage and smithy. At first, her excursions were limited to the mercantile, where she purchased supplies for the household with money Flynn provided. Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife who had donated the baby clothes, proved to be one of the few townspeople willing to treat Bethany with kindness rather than condemnation. "Don't you mind the others, Mrs. Henderson advised during one of Bethany's visits, nodding toward a group of women who had fallen conspicuously silent upon Bethany's entrance. "They've got nothing better to do than pass judgment on matters that don't concern them." "It's kind of you to say so," Bethany replied, adjusting Catherine in her arms. The baby had grown noticeably in the weeks since their arrival, her cheeks filling out, her alert eyes tracking movement with increasing focus. "Nothing kind about speaking the truth, Mrs." Henderson insisted, reaching out to chuck Catherine under the chin. "This little one's thriving, I can see that plain enough. You're doing right by her, and that's what matters." She lowered her voice, leaning closer. "And how are things with the blacksmith?" "Flynn's a good man, though he keeps to himself mostly." "Mr. Forrester has been very generous," Bethany said carefully, aware of listening ears. "The arrangement is strictly professional. I keep house and he provides shelter for my daughter and me, Mrs." Henderson's knowing smile suggested she might have her own theories about the situation, but she merely nodded. "Well, professional or not, it's done you both good. Flynn's looking less like a bear with a sore head these days. Amazing what regular meals and a tidy home can do for a man's disposition." Despite her embarrassment at the implication, Bethany couldn't deny that there was some truth to the observation. Flynn did seem more at ease than when she had first encountered him, more inclined to smile or even laugh during their evening conversations. And if she sometimes found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, noticing the strength in his hands or the way the firelight caught in his hair, well, that was her private concern. The first real test of their arrangement came on a Sunday morning in mid-August, when Bethany, dressed in her best gown with Catherine swaddled in a clean blanket, prepared to attend church services. She had avoided the church since her return to Sweetwater, knowing her father would not welcome her presence. But the desire to worship, ingrained since childhood, had grown too strong to ignore. Flynn, who had been repairing a loose hinge on the cottage door, looked up in surprise when she emerged from the bedroom in her Sunday attire. "You're going to church?" he asked, setting aside his tools. "Yes," Bethany confirmed, smoothing a nervous hand over her skirt. "I thought it was time." Flynn studied her for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "I'll escort you," he said, rising to his feet. "That isn't necessary," Bethany protested. "You've made it clear you're not one for church going." "I'm not," Flynn agreed, "but I'm also not one to let a lady face the wolves alone." He reached for his good coat, hanging on a peg by the door. "Besides, it might be interesting to see the Reverend's face when his daughter arrives with the town blacksmith and her baby in tow." Despite her nervousness, Bethany laughed at the image. "You're deliberately provoking scandal, Mr. Forrester." "Flynn," he corrected automatically, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And I'm merely accompanying my housekeeper to Sunday services like any responsible employer might do." They walked to church together, Bethany carrying Catherine, Flynn matching his long strides to her more measured pace. The bell was ringing as they approached the white clapboard building, summoning the faithful to worship. People were gathering on the steps, exchanging greetings and weekly news. The conversations faltered as Bethany and Flynn drew near, heads turning, eyes widening in surprise or narrowing in disapproval. Bethany's steps slowed, her courage threatening to desert her in the face of such open scrutiny. Flynn, sensing her hesitation, placed a supportive hand at the small of her back, not quite touching her but close enough to convey his presence. "Head high," he murmured. "You've as much right to be here as any of them." Drawing strength from his confidence, Bethany continued forward, climbing the steps with as much dignity as she could muster. She was acutely aware of the whispers that followed their progress, but she kept her gaze fixed on the church doors, where her father stood greeting his congregation. Reverend Evans froze when he caught sight of his daughter, his face paling beneath his neatly trimmed beard. For a moment, Bethany thought he might turn away or even forbid her entry, but the presence of his parishioners seemed to stay whatever impulse had initially seized him. "Reverend," Flynn greeted him evenly, removing his hat. "Fine morning for worship, Mr. Forrester," the Reverend acknowledged stiffly. His eyes flickered to Bethany and then to the bundle in her arms, a muscle working in his jaw. "I wasn't aware you had found religion." "I'm still searching," Flynn replied with deceptive mildness. "But Miss Evans was eager to attend services and I thought it proper to accompany her." The Reverend's gaze finally settled on his daughter, his expression carefully controlled. "Bethany," he said, the single word revealing nothing of his feelings. "Father," she responded, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I've come to worship, if we're welcome." A moment of tense silence followed, during which Bethany was acutely aware of the attention focused on their exchange. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, the Reverend stepped aside, gesturing toward the open doors. "All are welcome in the house of the Lord," he said, the words clearly costing him some effort. "Thank you," Bethany murmured, moving past him into the church, Flynn following close behind. They took seats in the last pew, as far from the pulpit as possible while still being inside the sanctuary. Bethany's mother and sisters were already seated in the front row, their backs rigid, none daring to turn and acknowledge her presence. A few of the congregation glanced over their shoulders, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility, but most kept their eyes forward, perhaps unwilling to draw the Reverend's attention. The service proceeded as Bethany remembered, with familiar hymns and responsive readings leading into her father's sermon. Today's text was from the Gospel of John, the story of the woman caught in adultery whom Jesus had saved from stoning with the simple challenge, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Bethany felt Flynn stiffen beside her as the Reverend began to expound on the text, his initial words emphasizing the woman's sin and the rightness of the law that condemned her. It seemed a pointed message, and Bethany found herself shrinking slightly in her seat. Catherine clutched protectively against her chest. But as the sermon continued, something unexpected happened. The Reverend's tone shifted, his focus moving from condemnation to Christ's mercy, from judgment to redemption. "We are quick to cast stones," he said, his gaze sweeping the congregation, "quick to condemn those whose sins seem more visible than our own. But the Lord reminds us that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All require mercy. All stand in need of grace." It wasn't an apology or even an acknowledgement of his treatment of Bethany, but it was perhaps as close as her proud father could come to admitting the possibility that his harsh judgment might not align perfectly with divine will. Bethany felt tears threatening and blinked them back, unwilling to give the watching congregation any further cause for gossip. Flynn's hand found hers on the pew between them, a brief, reassuring pressure that was gone almost as soon as it registered. The simple gesture steadied her, and she managed to maintain her composure through the remainder of the service. As the congregation filed out afterward, several women approached Bethany, drawn by curiosity about the baby if nothing else. Mrs. Henderson was among them, cooing over Catherine and loudly proclaiming her to be the prettiest baby in the territory, bar none. Her open approval seemed to give others permission to be civil, if not exactly warm, and Bethany found herself engaged in brief, awkward conversations about the child's health and development. Flynn remained at her side throughout, a solid presence that somehow made the interactions less intimidating. When they finally began the walk back to the cottage, Bethany felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "Thank you for coming with me," she said once they were beyond earshot of the church. "It made things easier." Flynn nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Your father surprised me," he admitted. "I expected more fire and brimstone, less mercy." "He surprised me too," Bethany said softly. "Perhaps there's hope yet." Flynn glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Hope for reconciliation? Bethany considered the question as they walked, Catherine sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I don't know," she said finally, "but hope for understanding maybe, for acceptance in time." They continued in companionable silence, the late summer sun warm on their faces. Bethany found herself stealing glances at Flynn's profile, struck by how comfortable she had become in his presence. It was more than gratitude for his protection, though that remained. It was a growing awareness of him as a man, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness with Catherine, the intelligence that gleamed in his eyes when they discussed the books he sometimes borrowed from Mrs. Henderson's lending library. Dangerous thoughts, she reminded herself sternly. Flynn Forrester had offered shelter and employment, not courtship. Whatever warmth existed between them was friendship at most, and she would be foolish to imagine otherwise, especially given her circumstances. Yet that evening, as they shared a simple supper of roast chicken and fresh bread, Bethany caught Flynn watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. When their hands accidentally brushed as she passed him the salt, the contact seemed to linger, charged with something neither of them was prepared to name. "I should check on the forge," Flynn said abruptly, rising from the table. "Make sure everything's properly banked for the night." "Of course," Bethany replied, busying herself with clearing away the dishes to hide her confusion at his sudden departure. "I'll just tidy up here." Flynn paused at the door, turning back as if he wanted to say something more. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, and Bethany felt a current of awareness pass between them, powerful enough to momentarily steal her breath. Then Flynn nodded once, almost to himself, and was gone, leaving Bethany to wonder what had just transpired and what it might mean for their carefully constructed arrangement. In the forge, Flynn paced the length of the workspace, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He had not anticipated this complication when he had offered Bethany and Catherine shelter. He had acted out of basic decency, recognizing a fellow human being in distress and providing what assistance he could. It had been a straightforward decision, unclouded by personal feelings. But over the weeks, as he had watched Bethany transform the cottage into a home, observed her unwavering devotion to her daughter, and discovered the quiet strength that allowed her to face the town's judgment with dignity, something had shifted. He found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, enjoying the sound of her laughter, admiring the grace with which she moved through the world despite the burdens she carried. And today, seeing her face in the church, illuminated by a shaft of sunlight through the stained glass windows as she sang the old hymns with evident faith despite everything she had endured, it had awakened feelings Flynn had thought long buried. Feelings he had no right to harbor toward a woman who depended on him for shelter and safety. He would not take advantage of her vulnerable position. He would maintain the boundaries they had established, continue to sleep in the forge, and treat her with the respect she deserved. Anything else would be dishonorable, and whatever else life had made of Flynn Forrester, he still believed in honor. With that resolution firmly in mind, Flynn set about banking the forge fire for the night, trying to ignore the image of Bethany's face that seemed permanently imprinted on his consciousness. September brought the first hints of autumn to Sweetwater, the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to show touches of gold among their green leaves. The days remained warm, but the nights carried a new crispness that spoke of changing seasons. Catherine, now nearly 4 months old, had become more alert and responsive, rewarding her mother and Flynn with toothless smiles that never failed to delight them both. Bethany had established a cautious routine of attending church each Sunday, sometimes accompanied by Flynn, sometimes going alone with Catherine when Flynn's work required his attention. The initial shock of her return to the congregation had faded, replaced by a wary acceptance that, while far from welcoming, at least allowed her to worship without feeling like a spectacle. Her father maintained a formal distance, acknowledging her presence with a nod but making no attempt at private conversation. Her mother remained aloof, though Bethany occasionally caught her stealing glances at Catherine during services, a flicker of something like longing crossing her otherwise composed features. Her sisters, constrained by parental authority, limited their interactions to hesitant smiles and whispered greetings when they thought themselves unobserved. It was progress of a sort, Bethany supposed, though far from the reconciliation she sometimes allowed herself to imagine in unguarded moments. Still, the regular presence at church had other benefits, gradually reintegrating her into the community in small but significant ways. Mrs. Henderson remained her most vocal supporter, but others had begun to thaw, particularly as they witnessed Bethany's devotion to her child and her modest, hard-working approach to her changed circumstances. The arrangement with Flynn continued to function smoothly on the surface. though Bethany was increasingly aware of an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with practicalities, and everything to do with the feelings she could no longer deny were developing. She found herself watching for his return in the evenings, taking extra care with meals she knew he particularly enjoyed, treasuring the moments when he would hold Catherine, his large hands cradling the infant with surprising tenderness. It was foolish, she knew. Flynn had given no indication that he saw her as anything more than a responsibility he had assumed out of kindness. If he sometimes lingered over supper, engaging her in conversations that stretched late into the evening, it was likely just appreciation for companionship after a day of solitary work. If his eyes occasionally followed her movements with an intensity that made her flush, it was probably nothing more than natural male awareness of a woman sharing his living space. Bethany was determined not to misinterpret these signs or to burden Flynn with unwanted attention. He had done more than enough for her and Catherine. The last thing he needed was a lovesick woman complicating what had been a straightforward arrangement. These thoughts occupied her mind as she hung laundry to dry in the yard behind the cottage one crisp September morning. Catherine lay nearby on a blanket spread in a patch of dappled shade, contentedly waving her arms at the leaves shifting in the gentle breeze above her. The rhythmic clang of Flynn's hammer provided a familiar backdrop to the domestic scene, punctuated occasionally by the whinny of a horse brought to the smithy for shoeing. Bethany was so absorbed in her task and her thoughts that she didn't immediately notice the approaching rider until the horse's hooves sounded on the packed earth of the yard. Turning, she found herself facing a well-dressed man astride a handsome bay gelding, his expression curious as he surveyed the domestic scene before him. "Good morning," he called, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for Flynn Forrester. The fellow at the general store said I'd find him here." "Yes, he's in the smithy," Bethany replied, gesturing toward the building where Flynn worked. "Just follow the sound of the hammer." The stranger dismounted with easy grace, looping his reins over the hitching post before approaching Bethany with an outstretched hand. "Daniel Harrington," he introduced himself. "Flynn and I served together during the war." "Bethany Evans," she responded, briefly clasping his hand. "I keep house for Mr. Forrester." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly at this information, his gaze moving from Bethany to Catherine on her blanket and back again with undisguised speculation. Before he could comment, however, Flynn emerged from the smithy, alerted by the sounds of conversation in the yard. "Danny." He called, recognition and surprise evident in his voice. "Is that really you, in the flesh, old friend?" Daniel confirmed, turning to greet Flynn with a hearty handshake that quickly transformed into an embrace. "It's been too long." 7 years at least, Flynn agreed, clapping his friend on the back before stepping away to study him. "You're looking prosperous. Life must be treating you well." Daniel laughed, a warm, open sound that matched his easy manner. "Can't complain. Banking suits me better than soldiering ever did." He glanced around at the smithy and cottage. "And you've done well for yourself too, I see. Your own business, a fine home." His eyes flickered meaningfully toward Bethany. "Charming company." Flynn's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Evans is my housekeeper," he said, his tone neutral but definite. "She and her daughter have rooms in the cottage while I sleep in the smithy." "Ah," Daniel said, having the grace to look slightly abashed at his presumption. "My apologies, Miss Evans. I didn't mean to imply anything improper." "No offense taken, Mr. Harrington," Bethany assured him, though she felt a flush rising in her cheeks. "If you gentlemen will excuse me, I should see to dinner preparations. Mr. Harrington, you're welcome to join us if your business in Sweetwater permits." "Most kind," Daniel replied with a warm smile. "I'd be delighted to accept." Bethany gathered Catherine from her blanket and retreated to the cottage, leaving the two men to their reunion. As she prepared a stew that could be stretched to accommodate an unexpected guest, she found herself curious about this link to Flynn's past. He rarely spoke of his experiences during the war, deflecting questions with vague references to having done his part like many others. Daniel Harrington might provide insights into the man Flynn had been before coming to Sweetwater, before the scar that marked his face, and the reserve that sometimes seemed like a wall between him and the world. The men's voices drifted through the open window as they moved from the yard to the shade of the smithy's overhang, their conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. It was the most animated Bethany had ever heard Flynn, and she felt a twinge of something like jealousy at the easy camaraderie he shared with his old friend. By the time she called them in for the midday meal, Catherine was fed and sleeping in her cradle, and the stew was simmering fragrantly on the stove. Daniel entered the cottage with appreciative glances at the tidy interior, complimenting Bethany on the homey atmosphere she had created. "Flynn always did have an eye for quality," he remarked as they settled at the table, his tone light but his eyes assessing as they moved between Bethany and his friend. Though in the old days, he was more interested in fast horses than domestic comforts. "People change," Flynn said shortly, passing the bread basket to Daniel. "War has a way of rearranging priorities." "Indeed it does," Daniel agreed, his expression sobering momentarily before he turned to Bethany with renewed cheer. "So, Miss Evans, how does a lovely young woman like yourself come to be keeping house for this old warhorse? I imagine there must be more eligible situations in town." The question, though couched in jovial terms, probed directly at the circumstances Bethany had carefully avoided discussing. She felt Flynn tense beside her, ready to intervene, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "My situation is somewhat complicated, Mr. Harrington," she said evenly. "Mr. Forrester was kind enough to offer employment when others were less inclined to do so. I'm grateful for his generosity." Daniel studied her for a moment, his gaze shrewd beneath his affable exterior. "I see," he said finally. "Well, Flynn always did have a soft spot for those in difficult circumstances. It was that tendency that got him into trouble more than once during our service together." "You make it sound like a weakness," Flynn observed, his tone light but with an underlying edge. "Not at all," Daniel countered smoothly. "It's one of your finest qualities, even if it did lead to that regrettable incident in Nashville." Bethany's curiosity was piqued, but Flynn clearly had no intention of elaborating on whatever incident Daniel was referencing. He deftly changed the subject, inquiring about his friend's journey to Sweetwater and his plans while in town. As the meal progressed, Bethany learned that Daniel was now a banker in Denver, traveling through Wyoming territory to assess potential investments in the region's growing towns. He was considering establishing a branch of his bank in Sweetwater, drawn by reports of the settlement's strategic location along cattle drive routes and the recent discovery of modest coal deposits in the surrounding hills. "The town's ripe for development," Daniel explained enthusiastically. "With the right investments, it could become a significant hub for the territory, which is partly why I sought you out, Flynn. I remembered your skill with metal, and I'm in need of someone who can craft quality safes and secure fixtures for a banking establishment." Flynn looked surprised but intrigued by the proposition. "That's specialized work," he said thoughtfully. "I've done some, but nothing on the scale you'd need for a bank. But you could learn," Daniel pressed. "You always were a quick study. And I'd pay handsomely for the work enough that you might consider expanding your operation, taking on an apprentice to handle the routine smithing while you focus on the more lucrative specialized commissions." The prospect was clearly appealing to Flynn, though he remained characteristically cautious in his response. "It's worth discussing further," he allowed. "How long will you be in town?" "A few days at least," Daniel replied. "I've taken a room at the hotel and have meetings scheduled with several property owners and town officials." He glanced at Bethany, his expression speculative. "Perhaps Miss Evans would permit me to call again tomorrow evening. We could discuss the details over supper, and I'd welcome the opportunity to sample more of her excellent cooking." Before Bethany could respond, Flynn interjected smoothly. "I'm sure Miss Evans wouldn't mind preparing supper for us, but perhaps we should meet at the hotel dining room. It would be more appropriate for business discussions." The slight emphasis on appropriate was not lost on either Bethany or Daniel. The banker's eyes flickered between them, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Of course," he agreed readily. "The hotel it is." 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. At Flynn's nod, Daniel rose from the table, thanking Bethany for the meal. "I should be on my way. I have an appointment with your mayor this afternoon." Flynn escorted his friend outside, their voices growing fainter as they moved toward the hitching post where Daniel's horse waited. Bethany began clearing the table, her mind full of the unexpected visitor and the possibilities his proposal might open for Flynn. The sound of hoofbeats signaled Daniel's departure, and moments later Flynn returned to the cottage, his expression thoughtful as he leaned against the doorframe watching Bethany wash the dishes. "I apologize for Daniel," he said after a moment. "He has a habit of making assumptions and speaking too freely." "There's no need to apologize," Bethany assured him, drying her hands on her apron. "He seems like a good friend despite his forwardness." Flynn's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "He is that. We've known each other since we were boys in Pennsylvania. Served in the same regiment during the war, though he was an officer and I a common soldier." "He mentioned an incident in Nashville," Bethany ventured, unable to completely suppress her curiosity. Flynn's hand rose unconsciously to the scar on his cheek, tracing its jagged path. "That's a story for another time," he said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed for now. "I should get back to work. Jenkins is bringing his team by later for new shoes, and I've still got Widow Parker's gate hinges to finish." He turned to go, then paused, glancing back at Bethany. "His offer is interesting, though. Specialized metalwork for banks and businesses pays better than shoeing horses and mending plows." "It sounds like an opportunity worth considering," Bethany agreed. "You're certainly skilled enough for such work." Flynn nodded, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "It would mean changes," he said finally. "Good ones, I think, but changes nonetheless." With that cryptic remark, he returned to the smithy, leaving Bethany to wonder exactly what changes he envisioned and how they might affect her and Catherine's place in his life. The following evening, Flynn dressed with unusual care for his dinner meeting with Daniel, donning a clean shirt and his seldom-worn Sunday suit. Bethany helped him with his tie, her fingers deft as she shaped the knot, acutely aware of his proximity and the clean scent of soap that clung to his freshly shaved skin. "There," she said, stepping back to survey her handiwork. "Very distinguished." Flynn grimaced, running a finger around the collar that clearly felt constrictive after his usual casual attire. "Distinguished or not, I feel like I'm being strangled," he grumbled, but there was a lightness to his complaint that suggested excitement rather than genuine discomfort. "A small price to pay for progress," Bethany teased, brushing an imaginary speck of lint from his shoulder. "Mr. Harrington will be impressed by your professional appearance." "Daniel's seen me covered in mud and worse," Flynn pointed out wryly, "but I suppose appearances matter in business." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small pouch which he handed to Bethany. "Your wages for the month," he explained, "plus a little extra. I thought you might want to visit the mercantile tomorrow. Catherine's growing fast and winter will be here before we know it." Bethany accepted the pouch, surprised by its weight. "This is too much," she protested, feeling the coins through the soft leather. "It's what you've earned," Flynn insisted, "and what you'll need for the child as she grows." Before Bethany could argue further, a knock at the door announced Catherine's awakening from her evening nap. "Go," she urged Flynn. "You don't want to be late for your meeting. I'll see to Catherine." Flynn nodded, retrieving his hat from its peg. At the door, he paused, turning back to Bethany with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Wait up for me?" he asked, the request carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to the simple words. "Of course," Bethany promised, puzzled but willing. "I'll keep the lamp burning." With a final nod, Flynn departed, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led toward town. Bethany attended to Catherine, changing and feeding her before settling into the rocking chair with a mending basket, trying not to speculate too much about the discussion taking place at the hotel and what it might mean for their future. Despite her best intentions, her mind kept returning to Flynn's parting request. "Wait up for me." Such a small thing, yet it had felt significant somehow, as if he had news he was eager to share, decisions he wanted to discuss. The thought both excited and unsettled her. Change was inevitable, she supposed, but the life they had constructed over the past months had become precious to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The cottage felt like home, and Flynn had become far more than an employer or benefactor. He was a friend, a presence she had come to rely on, a man whose approval mattered to her in ways that sometimes frightened her with their intensity. If Daniel's proposal meant Flynn would be expanding his business, taking on different work, perhaps even moving to larger premises, where would that leave her and Catherine? The hours crept by, Catherine sleeping peacefully in her cradle while Bethany alternated between mending and reading, her attention frequently straying to the window where she could see the lights of town glowing in the distance. It was nearly 10 o'clock when she heard footsteps approaching, followed by the sound of the door opening and Flynn's familiar tread in the entryway. Bethany looked up from her book, taking in Flynn's appearance, tie loosened, jacket draped over one arm, a flush of excitement or perhaps alcohol coloring his cheeks. "How was your meeting?" she asked, setting aside her reading. "Productive," Flynn replied, hanging his hat on its accustomed peg. "Daniel's serious about establishing a bank here, and he wants me involved not just in crafting the fixtures but potentially as an investor." "An investor?" Bethany echoed, surprised. "I didn't realize you had funds for such an enterprise." Flynn settled into the chair opposite her, stretching his long legs toward the hearth where a small fire warded off the evening chill. "I've saved most of what I've earned since coming to Sweetwater," he explained, "living simply with few expenses. And my parents left me a modest inheritance that I've never touched. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to buy a stake in a promising venture." "That's wonderful," Bethany said sincerely, genuinely happy for the opportunity that had presented itself to him. "You deserve success after all your hard work." Flynn studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "It would mean changes," he said finally, echoing his earlier remark. "The bank would be located on Main Street, and Daniel suggests I move my smithy operations closer to it for convenience and visibility. There's a property available near the edge of town larger than what I have here, with a proper house instead of just the cottage." "I see," Bethany said carefully, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "That makes sense from a business perspective. The house has 4 bedrooms," Flynn continued, watching her closely, "more than enough space for a family." Bethany's hands stilled in her lap, her heart suddenly racing. "A family," she repeated, unsure if she was interpreting his meaning correctly. Flynn leaned forward, his gaze intent on her face. "Bethany, I've been thinking about this for some time now, even before Daniel arrived with his proposal. These past months, having you and Catherine here, it's changed things for me, changed what I want from life." "What are you saying, Flynn?" Bethany asked, barely trusting herself to speak above a whisper. "I'm saying that I want you and Catherine to come with me to the new property," Flynn said, the words coming faster now, as if he feared losing his courage if he hesitated. "Not as my housekeeper, but as my wife, if you'll have me." Bethany stared at him, stunned by the sudden proposal. "Your wife?" She echoed faintly. "Flynn, you can't mean that. The scandal, the gossip, it would affect your business prospects, your standing in the community." "I don't give a damn about gossip," Flynn said firmly. "And any business that would suffer because of who I choose to marry isn't one I care to be involved with. Daniel himself said he thought it was high time I settled down, and he had already assumed there was more between us than an employer-employee relationship." "But Catherine is part of the package," Flynn interrupted, his expression softening. "That little girl has wound herself around my heart as surely as her mother has. I'd be proud to raise her as my own, to give her my name and all the protection that comes with it." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes, blurring her vision. "Why would you do this?" she asked, needing to understand his motivations before she could allow herself to hope. "Is it pity, some sense of obligation because you took us in when no one else would?" Flynn rose from his chair, crossing to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "It's neither pity nor obligation," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's love, Bethany, plain and simple. I love your strength, your kindness, your devotion to your child. I love the way you sing when you think no one is listening, and how you stand up to the town's judgment with your head held high. I love coming home to find you here, and I hate leaving each night for the cold emptiness of the forge." A tear spilled down Bethany's cheek, followed by another. "I never dared hope," she whispered. "After everything that happened, I thought no decent man would want me, especially with another man's child." "Then you underestimated this particular man's capacity for loving what others foolishly reject," Flynn said, reaching up to brush away her tears with gentle fingers. "Catherine isn't a burden to be tolerated, Bethany. She's a gift, you both are." The word struck Bethany with particular force, remembering how her father had refused even to name her daughter, referring to her only as that bastard. How different Flynn's perspective was, seeing not shame but blessing, not judgment but acceptance. "I love you too," she admitted, the words both frightening and freeing as they left her lips. "I've tried not to, knowing my situation, but I couldn't help myself." Flynn's smile transformed his face, erasing the habitual reserve and lighting his eyes with a joy Bethany had never seen there before. "Then say yes," he urged, squeezing her hands. "Say you'll marry me and let me be a father to Catherine. Say you'll build a life with me, here in Sweetwater or wherever the future takes us." "Yes," Bethany whispered, and then more strongly, "Yes, Flynn Forrester, I will marry you." With a sound that was half laugh, half sigh of relief, Flynn gathered her into his arms, holding her close as if afraid she might vanish if he loosened his embrace. When he finally drew back, it was only far enough to frame her face with his hands, his gaze searching hers for a moment before he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that was tender yet fiercely possessive. Bethany responded with a hunger that surprised them both, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing closer as years of loneliness and months of unacknowledged yearning found release in this moment of connection. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily, their faces flushed with more than just the heat of the fire. "I should go," Flynn said reluctantly, resting his forehead against hers. "Until we're properly married, I need to maintain at least the appearance of propriety, for your sake if nothing else." "When?" Bethany asked, not bothering to pretend she didn't understand his meaning or that she didn't share his sudden impatience. "How soon can we be married?" Flynn's eyes darkened at her eagerness, his hands tightening on her waist. "As soon as possible," he said fervently. "I'll speak to the circuit judge when he comes through next week. He can perform the ceremony without involving your father, if that's what you prefer." Bethany considered this, torn between practical expedience and a lingering hope for reconciliation. "No," she decided finally. "I want to be married in the church by my father if he'll do it, not out of respect for his authority, but because I have nothing to be ashamed of in loving you, Flynn. I want the whole town to witness that." Flynn studied her face, clearly moved by her courage. "Are you sure it won't be easy facing him with this request?" "I'm sure," Bethany confirmed. "We'll go together tomorrow and ask him properly. If he refuses, then we'll find another way. But I want to give him the chance to do the right thing, for Catherine's sake if nothing else." Flynn nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead before reluctantly releasing her and moving toward the door. "Tomorrow, then," he agreed, "we'll face whatever comes together." "Together," Bethany echoed, the word carrying a promise that sustained her long after Flynn had returned to the forge and she had retired to her bed, too exhilarated by the evening's developments to find immediate sleep. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the sky a crystalline blue that seemed to mirror Bethany's mood. She dressed with special care, selecting her best day dress and arranging her hair in a style that emphasized its natural waves. Catherine, as if sensing the importance of the day, was particularly agreeable, cooing happily as Bethany bathed and dressed her in the outfit Mrs. Henderson had provided for church attendance. Flynn arrived at the cottage just as Bethany was completing her preparations, his own appearance reflecting similar attention to detail. He had shaved carefully and donned his Sunday clothes despite it being only Tuesday, his hair neatly combed, his expression a mixture of determination and barely suppressed joy when he caught sight of Bethany. "You look beautiful," he said simply, crossing to her side and bending to press a chaste kiss to her cheek. "Both of you do." "And you look very handsome," Bethany returned, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from his lapel, still somewhat amazed that she now had the right to such gestures of intimacy. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be to face the Reverend Evans in his own territory," Flynn replied with a wry smile. "But for you and Catherine, I'd face far worse." They walked to the parsonage together, Flynn carrying Catherine while Bethany gathered her courage for the confrontation ahead. The minister's house stood adjacent to the church, a modest two-story structure distinguished mainly by its well-tended garden, the pride of Bethany's mother. It was her mother who answered their knock, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of her daughter and the blacksmith standing on her doorstep with Catherine between them. For a moment, Bethany thought she detected a softening in her mother's usually stern countenance, a flicker of longing as her gaze settled on the baby who was, after all, her first grandchild. "We've come to speak with Father," Bethany said, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Is he at home?" Mrs. Evans hesitated, clearly torn between ingrained disapproval and maternal instinct. Finally, she nodded, stepping back to allow them entry. "He's in his study," she said. "I'll tell him you're here." She disappeared down the hallway, leaving them standing in the formal parlor where Bethany had spent countless hours practicing piano and entertaining the occasional suitor under her parents' watchful eyes. How different things were now, she reflected, glancing at Flynn, who stood examining a daguerreotype of the Evans family taken several years earlier, before their move west. "You were just as pretty then," he observed quietly, noting her gaze. "But there's a strength in you now that wasn't visible before." Before Bethany could respond, footsteps in the hallway announced her father's approach. The Reverend entered the parlor with the measured tread that had always signaled his more solemn pronouncements. His expression guarded as he took in the tableau before him his daughter, the blacksmith, and the infant who represented both his greatest disappointment and, though he would never admit it, his deepest regret. "Bethany," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Mr. Forrester, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Flynn stepped forward, his posture straight, his manner respectful but not deferential. "Reverend Evans, I've come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage," he said, getting directly to the point. "I love Bethany and her child, and I want to make them my family in the eyes of God and the community." The Reverend's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise at this forthright declaration. "Indeed," he said after a moment's consideration, "and does my daughter return these sentiments?" "I do, Father," Bethany confirmed, moving to stand beside Flynn, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Flynn has been kind to us when others were not, but this isn't about gratitude or convenience. I love him, and I believe we can build a good life together, the three of us." Her father's gaze shifted to Catherine, who was regarding him with solemn eyes from the security of Flynn's arms. Something flickered across the older man's face, a complex emotion that might have been regret or longing or simply the recognition of how much had been lost through pride and rigid adherence to principles that perhaps had not fully accounted for human frailty and divine mercy. "And the child's father?" he asked finally. "What of him?" Bethany stiffened, but Flynn's hand at the small of her back steadied her. "He made his choice when he learned of my condition," she said evenly. "He wanted no part of us then, and he has forfeited any right to be part of our lives now." The Reverend nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "And you, Mr. Forrester, you're prepared to take on another man's child, to give her your name and raise her as your own." "I am," Flynn replied without hesitation. "Catherine is an innocent in all this, deserving of love and protection. I intend to provide both, along with everything else a father should give his daughter." A tense silence followed this declaration, broken unexpectedly by Mrs. Evans, who had been hovering in the doorway, ostensibly to offer refreshments but clearly intent on witnessing the exchange. "James," she said, addressing her husband with unusual directness, "the child is our blood, whatever the circumstances of her birth. And Mr. Forrester is offering our daughter honorable marriage. Surely that counts for something in the eyes of the Lord." The Reverend turned to his wife, surprise evident in his expression. It was perhaps the first time in their long marriage that she had openly questioned his judgment in matters of faith and family. The moment stretched, fraught with the potential for further division or unexpected reconciliation. Finally, the Reverend sighed, a sound that seemed to release some of the rigid posture he had maintained since entering the room. "The scriptures tell us that love covers a multitude of sins," he said slowly, "and that what God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He looked directly at Flynn. "Do you intend to have this union blessed in the church, Mr. Forrester, if you're willing to perform the ceremony, sir?" Flynn confirmed. "It would mean a great deal to Bethany and to me as well to have your blessing." Another long moment passed as the Reverend considered this request, his gaze moving from Flynn to Bethany and finally settling on Catherine, who chose that moment to offer him a toothless smile that transformed her small face with innocent joy. "Very well," he said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I will perform the ceremony 1 month from today. That will allow time for the banns to be read and for the necessary preparations to be made." Bethany felt tears threatening at this unexpected concession. "Thank you, Father," she said softly. "It means more than I can express." The Reverend nodded, some of his customary reserve returning. "There will be conditions," he warned. "I expect regular church attendance from both of you, and the child must be properly baptized before the wedding can take place." "Of course," Flynn agreed readily. "We had already planned to have Catherine baptized as soon as possible." "Then it's settled," the Reverend said with finality. "I will announce the upcoming nuptials at next Sunday's service, and we will proceed from there." He hesitated, then added with what almost might have been a smile, "I trust you will continue your current living arrangements until the wedding, Mr. Forrester. My daughter's reputation has suffered enough without adding further fuel to the gossip's fire." "Yes, sir," Flynn assured him. "I'll remain in the forge until we're properly married." This commitment seemed to satisfy the Reverend, who nodded once more before excusing himself to return to his sermon preparations. His departure left a palpable sense of relief in the parlor, as if a storm had threatened but ultimately passed without breaking. Mrs. Evans, however, lingered, her gaze fixed on Catherine with undisguised longing. "May I?" she asked hesitantly, extending her arms toward the baby. Flynn glanced at Bethany, who nodded and carefully transferred Catherine to her grandmother's waiting embrace. Mrs. Evans cradled the infant with practiced ease, her expression softening as she examined the tiny features that perhaps reminded her of Bethany's own infancy. "She has your eyes," she observed quietly to her daughter, "and your father's chin, though he'd never admit to seeing the resemblance." "Would you like to visit with her sometimes?" Bethany offered, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. She should know her grandmother. Mrs. Evans nodded, a suspicious brightness in her eyes as she gently rocked Catherine. "I would like that very much," she admitted. Perhaps you could bring her by on Thursday afternoons. Your father has his deacon's meeting then, and we could have tea together." "Thursday afternoons would be perfect," Bethany agreed, her heart lightening at this unexpected opening for reconciliation. They stayed a while longer, allowing Mrs. Evans time with her granddaughter and discussing preliminary plans for the wedding ceremony. When they finally took their leave, Bethany felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and elation, as if she had survived a battle she had been dreading only to discover that victory brought its own kind of fatigue. "That went better than I expected," Flynn observed as they walked back toward the cottage, his hand warm around hers, a tangible reminder of the commitment they had just formalized. "Much better," Bethany agreed, "though I still can hardly believe Father agreed to perform the ceremony. I was prepared for him to refuse. I think seeing Catherine may have changed something for him, Flynn suggested. "It's harder to maintain righteousness in the face of an innocent baby's smile." Bethany squeezed his hand, grateful for his insight and the gentle way he had handled the entire encounter. "Thank you for insisting we go together," she said. "I don't think I could have faced him alone." "You'll never have to face anything alone again," Flynn promised, bringing her hand to his lips for a brief kiss. "That's what marriage means, Bethany, sharing burdens and joys alike, standing together whatever comes." The words warmed her more deeply than the autumn sunshine that bathed the dusty street, illuminating a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility rather than dread. For the first time since learning of her pregnancy, Bethany felt truly hopeful, not just for survival but for happiness, a happiness made all the sweeter for having been so unexpected. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity, as preparations for the wedding progressed alongside Flynn's business negotiations with Daniel Harrington. The banker had been delighted to learn of their engagement, insisting on hosting a dinner at the hotel to celebrate the occasion and to finalize the details of their partnership in the new banking venture. "To new beginnings," Daniel had toasted, raising his glass to the couple. "May your marriage be as prosperous as our business will be." The town's reaction to the announced engagement was predictably mixed. Some, like Mrs. Henderson and the other merchants with whom Flynn had cultivated good relationships over the years, offered sincere congratulations. Others maintained a disapproving distance, clearly skeptical of the blacksmith's motives in marrying the disgraced daughter of the town's minister. "Let them talk," Flynn said dismissively when Bethany expressed concern about the whispers that still followed her through town. "They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough." True to his word, Flynn continued to sleep in the forge while Bethany and Catherine remained in the cottage, though their evenings now often extended late into the night as they planned their future together. The property Flynn had mentioned was indeed available for purchase, a substantial house with adjacent buildings that could be converted to a more extensive smithy operation. Situated close enough to the proposed bank location to be convenient for business, but far enough from the saloons to provide a respectable environment for a family. "It needs work," Flynn acknowledged as they toured the property one crisp October afternoon, Catherine bundled against the autumn chill in Bethany's arms. "But the bones are good, and there's plenty of room for expansion as the family grows." The casual reference to future children sent a warm flutter through Bethany's chest. She had sometimes feared that Catherine would be her only child, that no man would want to father additional children with a woman who had already proven her moral weakness. Flynn's assumption that they would have children together was yet another gift, another healing of a wound she had carried since her banishment. "It's perfect," she assured him, envisioning curtains at the windows, a garden in the side yard, children's laughter filling the currently empty rooms. "A wonderful place to begin our life together." October gave way to November, the weather turning colder as the wedding day approached. Bethany, with the cautious assistance of her mother and the more enthusiastic help of Mrs. Henderson, prepared her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of deep blue wool that complemented her fair coloring, and acknowledged, without dwelling upon, the fact that this was not a traditional first marriage for a young woman. Catherine was baptized the Sunday before the wedding, her father and mother standing as godparents while Flynn stood proudly beside them, his face reflecting a joy that matched Bethany's own as the water was sprinkled over the baby's dark curls. The Reverend, performing the ceremony with uncharacteristic gentleness, officially bestowed the name Catherine Grace Evans upon his granddaughter, the middle name a subtle acknowledgement of the divine mercy that had ultimately led to this moment of familial reconciliation. Mrs. Evans wept openly during the baptism, reaching for her husband's hand in a rare public display of emotion that suggested the healing was not limited to her relationship with her daughter, but extended to the marital bond that had been strained by their differing responses to Bethany's situation. The wedding day dawned clear but cold, the ground frosted with the first hint of the winter to come. Bethany dressed in the parsonage, her mother helping with the buttons of her gown while her sisters finally permitted full contact with their disgraced sibling, exclaimed over Catherine, who had been outfitted in a white dress that Mrs. Henderson had spent hours embroidering with tiny flowers. "You look beautiful," her youngest sister Mary assured her, arranging the simple veil that would cover Bethany's upswept hair. "Flynn won't be able to take his eyes off you." "He's a good man," her mother added, adjusting the collar of Bethany's dress with fingers that trembled slightly. "Your father and we've come to see that. We were wrong to send you away as we did." It was the closest thing to an apology that Bethany had received, and she accepted it as such, embracing her mother with genuine forgiveness. "It's in the past now," she said softly. "Today is about new beginnings, not old hurts." The church was surprisingly full when they arrived, curiosity having drawn even some of the more disapproving townspeople to witness the unusual ceremony. Flynn waited at the altar, his back straight, his expression a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that melted into pure adoration when he turned to see Bethany walking down the aisle on her father's arm, Catherine in her mother's arms just behind them. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the Reverend setting aside his usual stern demeanor to speak eloquently of love's redemptive power and the sacred nature of the commitment being made not just between man and woman, but to the child they would raise together. When Flynn and Bethany exchanged vows, their voices were clear and confident, carrying to the farthest corners of the small church. And when Flynn slipped the simple gold band onto Bethany's finger, his hands were steady, his eyes holding a promise that went far beyond the words they had just spoken. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend declared, and for the first time in Bethany's memory, a genuine smile softened her father's austere features. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Flynn's kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their surroundings yet conveying a depth of feeling that brought color to Bethany's cheeks and elicited a few knowing chuckles from the congregation. As they turned to face the assembled witnesses as husband and wife, Bethany caught sight of Daniel Harrington in one of the back pews, his expression one of unfeigned delight at his friend's happiness. The reception that followed at the hotel dining room, hosted jointly by Daniel and the Reverend in a symbolic union of secular and spiritual approval, was more festive than many had expected. Music and dancing continued well into the evening, with even some of the previously disapproving townspeople offering congratulations and small gifts to the newlyweds. Through it all, Catherine was passed from arms to arms, admired and cooed over by people who had once shunned the very mention of her existence. Bethany watched with quiet amazement as her daughter charmed even the most reluctant hearts, her innocent smiles and grabbing fingers dissolving prejudices that no amount of reasoning could have penetrated. "She's going to be a beauty like her mother, Mrs. Henderson predicted, bouncing Catherine gently. "And with Flynn for a father, she'll have the good sense to match her looks." "Speaking of Flynn," Daniel interjected with a meaningful glance toward the clock, "isn't it about time you two made your escape? The hotel's finest suite awaits the bride and groom, courtesy of your most devoted friend and business partner." Bethany blushed at the implication, but Flynn merely laughed, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "Always practical, Danny," he observed, "but you're right, it's time we were going." He turned to Bethany, his expression softening. "Ready to begin our life together, Mrs. Forrester?" The name, heard for the first time, sent a thrill through Bethany that had nothing to do with the champagne she had sipped during the toasts. "Yes," she said simply, reaching for his hand. "More than ready." They made their farewells, leaving Catherine in the care of her grandmother, who had insisted on keeping the baby overnight to allow the newlyweds privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. As Flynn escorted Bethany up the hotel's grand staircase to the suite Daniel had arranged, she felt a curious mixture of nervousness and anticipation, aware that despite her technical experience, this night represented something entirely new, a joining based on love and commitment rather than momentary passion or misplaced trust. Flynn sensed her hesitation as they reached the door to their suite, pausing with the key in his hand to study her face in the soft lamplight of the hallway. "Nervous?" he asked gently. "A little," Bethany admitted. "It's different this time, it matters more." Flynn nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "We have all the time in the world," he assured her, unlocking the door but making no move to enter. "Nothing has to happen tonight that you're not ready for." His consideration only deepened Bethany's certainty that she had married not just a good man, but the right man, someone whose strength was matched by tenderness, whose passion was tempered by respect. "I'm ready," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I want to be your wife in every way, Flynn." With a smile that warmed her to her core, Flynn swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold in the time-honored tradition that symbolized the beginning of their shared life. As the door closed behind them, Bethany knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just shelter but home, not just security but love, not just acceptance but celebration of all that she was and all that she might become in this man's arms. In the years that followed, as Sweetwater grew from a dusty settlement to a thriving town, the Forresters became fixtures in the community. Flynn's partnership with Daniel Harrington proved successful beyond their initial expectations, the bank becoming the financial cornerstone of the region's development. The expanded smithy, now employing 3 journeymen and 2 apprentices, specialized in the high-quality metalwork that had become Flynn's trademark, while still providing essential services to the ranchers and homesteaders who formed the backbone of the local economy. Relations with the Evans family continued to improve over time, the Reverend's initial reluctance giving way to genuine affection for his son-in-law and undisguised doting on his grandchildren. Sunday dinners at the parsonage became a tradition, the extended family gathering to share news and strengthening bonds that had once seemed irreparably broken. Catherine, raised with no secret made of her origins, but with the unshakable security of Flynn's love and legal protection, grew up without the shadows that might have haunted a child in her position. On her 16th birthday, Flynn presented her with a locket containing miniature portraits of herself as an infant and Flynn on their first meeting, a tangible reminder of the day he had first called her gift and taken her into his heart. "You were the catalyst that brought your mother and me together," he told her, fastening the locket around her neck. "The greatest gift I've ever received, even before I fully understood what you would mean to me. Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked, the question reflecting a momentary vulnerability beneath her usual confidence. Taking on another man's child, facing the gossip, the judgment, Flynn's answer was immediate and firm. "Never," he said, cupping her cheek in his calloused palm. "Not for a single moment." "You are my daughter in every way that matters, Catherine. The circumstances of your birth are far less important than the person you've become and the joy you've brought to our family." From the doorway, Bethany watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, overcome anew by the magnitude of the blessing that had come disguised as disaster all those years ago. What had seemed like the end of all her hopes had proven to be merely the beginning of a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined on that dusty road outside Sweetwater, alone with her newborn and an uncertain future. Later that night, with their children sleeping safely in their beds, Bethany related the conversation to Flynn as they prepared for sleep in the comfortable intimacy of their shared bedroom. "You've been everything a father could be to her," she said, brushing her hair at the dressing table while Flynn watched from their bed. "More than I ever dared hope for when we first met. She made it easy," Flynn replied with a smile. "Loving her was as natural as breathing from the moment I first held her." His expression grew more serious as he added, "I sometimes think about him, you know, the man who fathered her but never knew what he was giving up. His loss has been my immeasurable gain." Bethany set down her brush, moving to join her husband in their bed, settling into the circle of his arms with the practiced ease of long familiarity. "I used to think of him with anger," she admitted, "but now I can almost find gratitude in my heart." If he had stood by me, I would never have known what it is to be truly loved, truly cherished, as you have loved and cherished us." Flynn tightened his embrace, pressing a kiss to her temple. "From the moment I saw you standing there with Catherine in your arms, something in me recognized something in you," he said softly. "Not just beauty or need or courage, though you had all of those in abundance. It was as if some part of my soul that had been waiting awakened and said, 'There she is. There's your family.' And here we are," Bethany murmured, leaning up to kiss him with all the tenderness and passion that 18 years of marriage had only deepened rather than diminished. "Your family, now and always." Outside their window, stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on velvet, witnesses to the journey that had brought them from strangers to lovers to partners in the truest sense of the word. And in the nursery down the hall, Flynn Forrester, for she had taken Flynn's name legally on her 12th birthday at her own insistence, slept with her new locket clutched in her hand, secure in the knowledge that she was not a burden to be endured but a gift to be treasured, the living embodiment of a love story that had begun with an act of kindness on a desperate day and blossomed into a legacy that would endure for generations to come.